Welcome back to the Spiderforest Webcomic Podcast. I'm Mathieu Moyen. In this episode, Fading into the Background. We all live in the real world, and so do our characters. Well, real to them anyway, and the design of an environment can be just as important to storytelling as the characters themselves. So in this episode, we're going to talk about all those little things you never knew you were seeing when you read a comic. First, Christina Major of the comic Sombulus will be bringing us an interview with Riana Dorsey of the comic Suihira. Then, I'll be back for a discussion with G. Pike of the comic Title Unrelated, Amy Stoddard of the comic Fine Sometimes Rain, and Laura Graves of the comic 666 Bistro. We've got a lot of new worlds to explore in this episode, so stay with us.
Hi, this is Christina Major. I make the comic Sombulus, and I am here with Riana Dorsey, who makes Suihira. I've seen your digital sketchbook, and it looks like Suihira was originally not set in a desert setting. So can you tell us a little more about what it was before and what made you switch it over?
The funny thing is that Suihira is actually always in a desert setting, but at the time it was like a low-key cyberpunk story, and Suihira was the city the story took place. Later on, I decided it'd be more fun to take that desert setting and run with it and make Suihira a mythological location that people pursued like as a kind of El Dorado type of thing. Basically what Iona is now, the city Wahida grew up in, that used to be Suihira, and I have no idea the story back then was so just a huge mess. I have no idea why it was called the City of Water. Maybe I thought it was a place with a lot of water in the desert. I don't know. It was a long time ago, but it was a very low-key cyberpunk desert story.
But you really switched it over to fantasy when you brought it over to, like you said, a more El Dorado quest for this lost city and this goddess. It's a very rich setting. I really love the wildlife, the climate. I could tell you put a lot of thought into what makes sense for their very extreme environment. How much of that did you start with? How much do you do on the fly? Where did your process start?
I don't really do too much on the spot, and it kind of started with just thinking about how the past events affected the current environment. I remember early on when I decided, okay, this is going to be a transition from low-key cyberpunk to low-key post-apocalyptic. So I watched Life After People a lot, and often fast forward to like when they were talking about like a couple hundred years after people lived, and I kind of took that into consideration. Because, as you may know, the Divine War, like, basically wiped out most of humanity, so they didn't do too much for a long time. But this is it's not important for the story, but the story actually takes place, right now anyway, at the bottom of the Mediterranean, sans ocean. So I have to consider the current environment of Southern Europe, Northern Africa, and Western Asia, and see how the animals and cultures from those regions affected this new culture. And as far as technology is concerned, also not important to the story, but just important for world building, the Divine War probably happened in the 1920s or 30s, so I try not to make technology more advanced than that. Hence why you see the boat that Wahida hid under. It's kind of more modern looking than what you expect in this kind of story. So it's kind of something for people to see and tilt their head and be like, huh?
Oh, wow. Okay. I totally didn't look at the boat close enough. But yeah, so it sounds like you really thought about, like, even in this post-apocalyptic setting, what kinds of remains are there hiding around? Oh, gosh, that's cool.
Thank you. But it's basic. I take all of that into mind and think about, okay, what happened if humanity was just completely, like, progress completely interrupted during that time, and they were focused on surviving for 500 years and establishing their own, like, new cultures or trying to preserve their old ones, which we will see later, and I'm so excited for that. And that's kind of just the net that everything is kind of caught onto, so to speak.
So just kind of starting with that seed of an idea and figuring out what makes sense, extrapolating from there, basically.
Pretty much.
So a lot of times fantasy comic creators will put a lot of their discovery writing and their legends straight up front. And one of the things that I love about the beginning of Suihira is that it's very overt and direct about its origin story without holding us back from the setting and the characters. So how do you do that? What are the key scenes and art decisions that you made to introduce readers to the setting in the beginning?
It was pretty tough because I actually think info dumping, exposition in the beginning of comics is really annoying. I think it's annoying in movies. I think it's annoying in comics. I remember reading a comic, a friend of mine did, and I think the first chapter was nothing but exposition. And I thought I kept seeing characters like, oh, here's the main character. I'm going to try to relate to this person, and then they go away forever. And it's just like, come on, man. Like, can I get a character to root for? I don't care. Like, as a reader, I don't personally care about world building unless it relates directly to a character, because characters are really what stories are about. Knowing this, and despite me having this just giant world building myself, I'm like, okay, I really need to be careful about what I present and how I present it. So I disguised the introduction to the main conflict, I suppose, as bonding time with these sisters. Like, oh, here's like it's like a story time little thing. It's less about exposition is important, but it's not as important as the sisters bonding. Like when people read chapter 1, they don't tell me, oh, backstory. They tell me, oh, sisters are so adorable and great, and I'm like, yes, perfect.
Yeah, that's something that you really did well, in my opinion, just because that kind of stuff can get really dry. I mean, even the whole, we're reading from a book of legends and stuff, that can get very dry. So the balance that you did, I guess, to pull the characters to the foreground.
It was purposeful that Wahida was 4 years old, because I'm explaining this really complicated backstory from an 8-year-old's point of view to a 4-year-old, so it was as basic as I can get. Then in chapter 1, I slowly kind of revealed a little bit more about what the current setting. You learn in the same scene that people don't think Suihira is real as you discover that Wahida is actually royalty. And then later on, I have the political point of view of the exposition disguised as a parade. And that was really fun and really... I was dreading that for a long time. I'm like, I have to do a parade, but I must, because that's such a good idea.
Yeah, the kind of establishing where it is culturally instead of having two politicians in a war room talking about things.
Yeah. It also, what I'm excited about it is that the parade completely contradicts what's been said earlier, so people kind of don't trust the exposition anymore. I mean, most readers believe the beginning, but maybe the parade has planted a small seed of doubt, I wonder what really happened, and that's what I wanted.
So you're drawing all these things, you're drawing parades, you're drawing cities that are former Mediterranean places or something just kind of condensed down. And you really do a great job with the backgrounds and the environments, just putting everything in a very compelling setting. And like you said, with the shipwreck and stuff, just kind of pulling in that stuff. So as an artist, do you ever feel like you just want to draw your characters and phone it in on the backgrounds? or do you just jump into every page saying, heck yeah, I get to draw sand again? A lot of times you hear from artists, why do I have to draw backgrounds? Oh my gosh, I hate backgrounds. What is your advice to them? Do you have any tools or thoughts for the people who find backgrounds to be too much work?
It's completely understandable, but I was actually, a long time ago, I remember I posted artwork on DeviantArt, and I got a really nice comment from somebody telling me that my backgrounds were a little bit on the underdeveloped side compared to my characters. And they told me to put as much love and thought for your backgrounds and for your settings as you do your characters. And this was probably, they said this to me over 10 years ago, and I've kind of kept that in the back of my mind. And you probably can kind of figure from the way I talk about the setting to me is its own character, and I treat it with as much thought and care as I do my characters. So at this point in my life, I really can't relate to people complaining about needing to draw backgrounds, because I think backgrounds are awesome. I can't say they're more important than the characters, but they're just, the details are just endless, and the possibilities are endless, and just what kind of rocks are you going to draw? What kind of trees? How are they going to be arranged? Is it going to be a manicured lawn? Is it going to be just a that kind of, like, there's a world building and backgrounds that you can incorporate, and I just think that's just a lot of fun. And it's really a mindset that you have to have when it comes to backgrounds, is that you have to be excited about furniture and architecture. Like, I had fun with the city that they're in right now in chapter 4, the city of Pani. I did research on I have concept art of Pani from 2012, where I did most of my concept art. It was more or less generic desert city stuff, but upon tackling it for the comic, I researched Western Italian and Sicilian architecture, and I said, okay, how would they build these cities 500 years later? It was a combination of a lot of Southeastern European stuff with Italian stuff, and that was just really fun to research and kind of draw from.
It does seem like you have a backstory for the setting, like you do with every character. I mean, a lot of times when people are establishing characters, they say, okay, well, this is what happened in their childhood, and this is what happens, blah, blah, blah. And now that we're seeing them at this age, this is the kind of person they are, and they'll have a backstory, maybe, but, maybe you won't go into that. And it sounds like with kind of this post-apocalyptic setting, you have, like, this is the world's toddler years, and this is the world's childhood, and because of that, this is how the world grew.
Yeah, no, it's exactly it. You kind of, I can speak this from experience from work too, that you naturally put in more effort and care into things if you happen to know a pretty detailed backstory. And yeah, I feel like the setting should have just as much of a backstory as any of your main characters, because that really just brings to life your world. Like, I can see comics that have really complex backstories with their characters and in their settings, but it doesn't reflect in the backgrounds, and that's always kind of distracting and disappointing to me, in the context where I can tell that they're trying to make a detailed backgrounds, but you can kind of feel the artist being like, oh, backgrounds,
Yeah.
but I don't know, it's just really fun to me to think about these details, like what material are the walls made out of, how did these people, in my case, how did these people take what they had before the apocalypse, in other words, and how do they adapt it to their current situation now? Like, in Iona, there's a lot of buildings that are basically made out of plaster and stuff, like mud houses, but fancier than that. And thinking about stuff like how in my case, how can they access wood? Oh, there's still stuff from before the apocalypse. There's still some dead trees they can still use. That kind of stuff I love thinking about, and how they still need doors? Do they still have glass in the windows? That kind of stuff is really fun for me to think about. So I can't really relate to artists complaining about backgrounds anymore.
Anything else you want to share, or parting words for people thinking about starting a webcomic, trying to figure out how much work to go into the setting?
It's kind of a common place to start when you make a story, to start with world building, because that is a really fun part. But in the end, you have to remember that if you want the story to resonate with people, you really need to have it be about characters and what they're trying to achieve. You can do as much fancy art as you want, and people do often remember fancy art, but in the end of the day, what people remember in any kind of story, whether it's in animation or comics or literature, people remember the story. And the art, while very important, cannot save a bad story. I think, anyway. So work on your plots.
Wow, that was another really great interview. And we have some members of the Spiderforest Webcomic Collective here to talk with us more about backgrounding and background design. With us today are G. Pike.
Hi.
Laura Graves.
Hello.
And Amy Stoddard.
Hello.
When you're working on comics, and this is a tendency that I struggled with early on, and I think everybody really goes through this kind of, at least either goes through the phase or works with it as best they can, is a tendency not to really want to do backgrounding at all. Like, it sort of can feel like a chore to people. And also, especially earlier on, when people are very focused on characters, which are particularly interesting to them, it can sort of seem like, why bother building backgrounds? Why bother working on environments when it's really all about the characters? So how do you manage that tendency?
I think for me, when I started my comics, I felt more like I wanted to tell the story of the world more than I did about my characters. The very first comic that I ever did, which is not online, and I destroyed it forever because it's bad. I literally just jumped in and said, all right, I got to start drawing backgrounds. And like the first 4 pages are just all backgrounds and no characters. A lot of my influences have a lot of detailed backgrounds. Like I like Masamune Shirow, who does like Ghost in the Shell and Appleseed and Hellsing and a couple others, and that all have very heavy backgrounds. So I just kind of looked at them and go, oh, they draw some cool stuff. So I just try to kind of imitate the people that I really like. But don't get me wrong, it was all really bad and broken perspective and all sorts of just not so good things going on.
In my experience, I went from being the kind of person who didn't like to do backgrounds to someone who is pretty decent at it, but it took me many years. My first comic, which was called Untitled, very minimal backgrounds. For the first, probably 5 years of the comic, backgrounds were very minimalist, and I wasn't great at it, and the perspective was very, very wonky. So when I started Title Unrelated, I kind of determined that I definitely need to use backgrounds to do establishing shots and to, set the stage and show where the characters are in their surroundings, things like the weather, the time of day, time of year, what sounds are going on, things like that. So from the beginning of Title Unrelated, I tried really hard to always, I have this policy of at the beginning of each scene, there will usually be a big establishing shot, usually without text even. And then I'll put in background sometimes to do things like break up long conversations with some visual interest, so that it's not just talking heads for days and days. You get to see some of the world or what characters in the background are doing as a conversation with some exposition or whatever is going on, which is kind of similar to what we heard in the interview, where she was mentioning doing this world-building exposition through the means of interaction between the characters and having it so that it doesn't feel like it's an info dump. It feels just like characters interacting with each other. So I think that's a great idea, actually.
If you think of it sort of like creating sets or scenes for a movie, like if you think of comics sort of like film, we've had another podcast about that. You wouldn't make a film where people are standing against blank backgrounds because you would have no sense of space. You'd have no sense of where the people are. You'd have no sense of things like weather or time of day, as mentioned. So, Amy, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I agree. You need a space for your characters to be in because they're part of a world. And for me, with backgrounds, when I first started, I was really influenced by shoujo manga, and a lot of times there isn't a lot of backgrounds in there. So a beginning artist will think to themselves, oh, well, I can get away with not drawing backgrounds then. Well, no, you can't. Because you really need to set scenes and have spaces for these characters to interact in, because if you want a scene to happen at a cafe, it needs to reasonably look like a cafe. You can do establishing shots really easy, especially if you use 3D modeling and stuff. And you don't even really have to add much drawing to it if you don't want to. And that's a way to start, but I mean, of course, you should really learn perspective and know how to use it and stuff like that too. And for me, I also really like nature, and I actually was a photographer, so I like to look at things cinematically, so I like to see things with the characters usually, but I still do a lot of, empty panels with talking head in it or whatever, because sometimes you need a breather. So I think that's probably about all I have to say.
Well, no, I think you make a very good point, though, which is something else I think we could go into, which is there's kind of a spectrum involved in when it's appropriate to show more background or less. You can show a fully rendered, fully detailed environment, or you can show, if you're showing close-ups on people, how much do you really want to show or need to show? I mean, it can become unrelieved and sort of unrelenting, and Laura, in particular, I would like to hear from you first, because I think that your comic, 666 Bistro, has an awful lot of detail in the backgrounding. In fact, I think it's what your comic is really known for.
Oh boy. So that is something I sometimes feel like I struggle with. Less is more sometimes. I have to think about it. So I try to balance between having, the establishing shots and kind of establishing where the characters are. And then I'll throw in kind of the talking head panels that kind of make it a breather. And I kind of reserve usually those. I know in advance there's going to be heavy dialogue in this panel. So I usually don't go too wild with the backgrounds. But that is something that I do kind of struggle with at times, thinking when should I turn it down a bit? You got to focus on thinking for the reader, here's a crazy panel with a lot of stuff. Now let's kind of turn it down and let them kind of absorb that and have kind of more simpler panels. And then that's when I throw my talking head panels or just something more simplified.
G, how about you? I know that you have a balance in Title Unrelated between indoor and outdoor environments, and you render all of them to a pretty refined degree. How do you sound that out? Is that something you reason out, or is it just sort of something you have to develop a knack for, do you think?
I would say that some of it is experience. Sometimes I really want to put a background in, but because of the update schedule or whatever, there isn't time to do a really detailed background, or there's so much text in a page that I'm like, well, I'm going to have to simplify the art for this page so that it can fit, in to balance the art with the dialogue so that one does not overwhelm the other or get in each other's way. Like I said, I tend to do these big establishing shots at the beginning of a scene, and any time that there's something I want to show, or if, say, the camera perspective changes to focus on a different character, I'll usually show the background of where that character is in the scene. It's informed a lot by things like filmmaking and those type of techniques for framing shots. And depending on what kind of feeling you want to give, is this a broad outdoor scene where we want to see a vista, or is this a cramped indoor scene where everyone's huddled up in a room and there isn't much even to look at beyond the characters? So I tend to actually draw a lot from my own experiences in life of where are the times and places when I noticed the scenery around me, which is most of the time in reality, but I try to pay attention to, observation when I'm out in the world of what are the things that catch my eye instantly? Like, what am I noticing immediately about my surroundings? And sort of use that to inform my ideas about what is the most, quintessential part of this environment that I'm in that I could then use to sort of describe that in comic shorthand in my comic. So I guess that's kind of how I approach it.
For me, I think about what I want to put emphasis on and what sort of mood I want to convey with my paneling. If a detailed background isn't going to give anything to the shot, I guess you could call it, then I will omit it. Like if I want to focus in on a character's emotion and I want to show sorrow or something like that, then I'll focus on expression and maybe lighting more than that, more than having a background, because the background really isn't important to carrying that emotion. But I guess when I first started out, I didn't really have that balance because I wasn't drawing very many backgrounds, but I do love nature and spaces, so I started drawing more of them. I don't know, I guess I just instinctively know, what needs to be done. Because I've been doing this for quite a long time, I guess. But yeah, I would say anything I want to emphasize, I put that front and center. Sometimes you can draw a really big space and a very small figure to convey solitude and loneliness and things like that. Those are the kinds of things I generally think about.
Something else that you mentioned earlier, which I think gets us sort of into more of a technical kind of a discussion, is that really we're at a point in time now where a lot of people are drawing digitally or have access to digital tools. And we really have an enormous opportunity now to use various tools such as 3D programs. We have massive repositories of photography and photographs available online. Do the tools that we have available now determine how you approach a task like backgrounding at this point? Is it really necessary to have as much of a technical education as was once necessary? Because I know that is something that deterred a lot of people early on. Or, I mean, it's one of the reasons that in comics up until probably the late 1990s, there was a division of labor between backgrounding and character designers, because backgrounding was such a specialized thing that sometimes they would bring somebody in specifically to draw backgrounds.
So I have little to no formal art education. I'm entirely self-taught from books, tutorials, and just trial and error, basically. I learned to do landscapes mostly from watching Bob Ross on PBS. So, but it's like I have studied how to do technical perspective a little bit. I've never been great at actually executing it. And for me, I feel that traditional media was really kind of holding me back because I always tended to draw fairly small and, there wasn't a lot of control or indeed room to set up, the tools that were needed to do proper perspective and everything. So digital art really has opened that up for me because I can do things like put a photo in the program, turn down the opacity, and copy the general layout shapes of a scene. If I can happen to find like the perfect photo or, composite several photos together to get what I'm going for, like with a building or something. I've done that quite a bit. I recently did manage to figure out how to use the perspective rulers in Clip Studio, which has been a big help. I find those very useful, both for drawing scenery and for drawing like characters in perspective and keeping things all lined up. But there is a certain degree to which I find that sometimes it's better to just eyeball it and get on with the work rather than fussing with trying to get everything perfect, because I can get really bogged down in those details if I let myself. Like, say, I'm using custom brushes to stamp in lots and lots of little plants everywhere, and I feel that at times I can go overboard with that and end up kind of muddying the design of the image because it'll just be too much little fiddly detail when the characters themselves are not that detailed in the drawings. It is important to balance the look of the background with the look of the character art or whatnot, and to not let them get too stylistically or detail-wise out of sync unless you're trying deliberately to emphasize something in the background. So there is kind of, I'd balance between doing these more loose type backgrounds, which are often just, I'm scribbling with a brush or a, fake watercolor style, and, these more rendered, whether it's painted or it's line art with coloring or whatever type scenery.
So my process, I'm pretty much entirely traditional when it comes to the pen and ink. I don't have a light table because I'm a cheapskate and I don't want to buy one right now. I want one though, don't get me wrong. I just don't want to pay for it. What I like to do is I kind of focus on line weight a lot to kind of make sure that things separate enough. I'm trying to look through my actual work right now, but like one of these pages I'm looking at, like the stuff that's closer to the foreground, I try to thicken up the line weight around those objects so that they stand out more in the foreground, so they don't blend too much with the background. I've also started working more in color, and I've been utilizing color more to kind of separate the background and the foreground so that the two don't get too muddled. I don't really use any 3D tools or anything. I wouldn't mind trying it out. I just haven't really had the opportunity or the time to really kind of sit down and try these tools. And then because I work traditionally, I realized that would incorporate additional steps of having to print it and then buy a light table that I don't want to pay for right now and start drawing over those pieces, or it just kind of, I feel like I'm not in a good place to start using those kind of tools, but I definitely can see the advantages in using them.
I have a tendency, if I know I'm going to be using a specific house or a specific space a lot and it's architectural, I will build a 3D model for it. And then I have the ability to take any shot from any angle, however I want. And then I take whatever establishing shot that I want, and then I export it as a TIFF, and then I import it into Clip Studio, and then usually I just use the straight up line work that you can get by exporting as a TIFF, but I know a lot of people will actually draw over that, so you have your own natural line weight, but I just like that really clean look because that's how it looks like in josei manga, so I kind of go that direction, and it does take a lot of effort to create the 3D model in that, but if you're comfortable enough in 3D modeling software, you may as well do it if you're going to be using that scene a lot. It saves a lot of time for me, especially, And then I guess another point would be that you still have to learn perspective, though. You can't just go in and use even pre-made models and expect, your work to come out like professional. You still have to be able to lay out perspective lines if you want to add any extra detail in there or whatever. Oh, and then somebody also mentioned the Clip Studios rulers. I really love those.
I don't actually use Clip Studio. I use Photoshop. Z-Restrict is the closest I come. Like, I have a hotkey for Shift so that I can rotate the entire page and use that to draw my guidelines, which is pretty much how I drafted when I still drafted by hand, which I don't really do anymore. But what are some of the pitfalls that you experience when you're going into designing an environment? Like, what are things that you sometimes forget? What are things that you're likely to focus on or not focus on that you think you sort of need to be conscious of as you're doing something like this?
For me, I do my comic in black and white. So one thing, especially when I'm doing nature, is I have to consider contrast and emphasis in the single panel or even the whole page. I have this book. It's like, I think it's called Drawing with Pen and Ink by Arthur Guptill or something like that. It has tutorials in there that show you how to get, like, if you want to put emphasis on a specific area of your background, like let's say you have two characters walking down the street and you want your emphasis to be on those characters, but they're kind of a little bit far back. And there's a way that you can surround them by black and have them mostly in white and then get some in-between shades in there. And then if you have high contrast, your eyes are going to be drawn to that. So I do think about that. I'm not sure that's a pitfall though, but it's something I do think about and sometimes I forget about. And then a piece can fail because you've got too much black here or too much contrast in another area.
I think for me right now, my area I'm finding the most difficulty with is sometimes just I feel like having the characters in the environment. At least with the latest chapter that I'm working on, I've done a lot more shots with the characters actually in the environments. But I felt like in a lot of my earlier pages and earlier comics, like I would do establishing shots and I'd show like the place they're at. But then it would quickly just turn into like talking heads because I had a difficult time getting the characters to actually be in that environment. I've been focusing on that more with a lot of the more recent pages that I've been working on, but definitely my earlier work was just I could draw the area and the scenes, but the moment I actually had to have a character in there, and then you had to start thinking about scale and okay, in this scene I drew the doorway this big, but now it's 10 times bigger or it's 10 times smaller and it doesn't make any sense. And so trying to be more consciously aware of those pieces that you just never think of until you get to it and you're like, oh geez.
Yeah, I've had that problem with doorway sizes and scale things like that quite a bit. So, yeah, that's definitely something I can relate to.
Scale is definitely one of the biggest issues. You register scale in the environment that you're in almost automatically because you're in it. You go out into nature and you stand in it and you know that trees are tall. Or you go into a small apartment and you know that it's small because the ceiling is only a certain number of inches from your head. So scale becomes this kind of thing that you register sort of naturally. But when you're drawing, you have to be much more conscious of that, I think. And that's a really, really good point you guys made, because it's knowing how to deliver a sense of depth in a scene is going to be a really big part of it. For me, also, one of the things that gets me is that one of the characters in my comic is actually a scale issue in himself, in that he is a gigantic vehicle. He's a robotic tank who's about 1,000 tons. So he himself forms a part of the background in scenes that he's in. And that really can become a difficult thing in itself, because how do you scale a human being against something that's 2.5, 3 stories tall and is talking? How do you give people the opportunity to have a conversation with something that size? That can be a real challenge for me personally. I know that's not something that everybody goes through, but it's certainly an issue for me. That's making me think of another point here as well, which is that to a certain extent you can see the environment that your characters are in as being a kind of character in the story, which is something I'd like to get your opinion on. I don't want to say anything that's going to get us kicked on copyright grounds, but I remember that somebody was talking about the show Star Trek, that the ship, the USS Enterprise, is kind of like a character in the show because it's the environment where all of this stuff happens. So here these guys are hurtling through space in this massive starship, but you always know you're getting the sense of what the parameters of the episode are based on where they are in the ship and what's happening in the ship. So the kind of drama that's happening, if it's a political drama, it's happening on the bridge, and if it's sort of a science drama, it's happening in engineering, and if it's some sort of a personal drama, then it's happening in the hospital, the sick bay. It's sort of elevating the environment to the role of a character that's setting the scene for the other characters to have their interactions in. Do you think that there's something to that?
Bringing up the Star Trek example is a really, really good example you brought up. But in my comic, from the get-go, I want to tell the story of the world they live in, but not necessarily through like info dumps and stuff like, let me sit down and tell you the history. I want when people read my comics to kind of get that through the artwork. And so that's kind of why like a lot of my backgrounds get a little detailed, because I'm trying to tell a story in it, but without the characters telling you the story. And I know it's kind of vague, how that method makes it a little vague without actually ever necessarily explaining it, but that's kind of what I really enjoy. Another example kind of like that is the movie Zootopia. I felt that the city itself, like there's like an opening sequence where she kind of takes the subway or whatever, and like that whole sequence just kind of tells you the story of the city. And then throughout the movie, you kind of learn about the city, and it itself is also kind of a character. And so that's kind of what I've been trying to do with my own comics, and it's kind of why a lot of my backgrounds and things like that are really detailed, because I'm trying to tell an additional story going on in this gigantic urban hellscape.
In the case of my comic, I do sort of think of the world and Baya as being sort of a character in and of itself, because I've spent so much time thinking about what is this, even though some parts of it are fairly generic or based on real-world places that I've been, I definitely wanted it to have a specific environment and climate feel, and the land and the wildlife and everything that's there is definitely meant to be seen as a living thing. The whole world is actually, seen as being connected through, energy, however you like to perceive that, and that's actually a thing that they talk about in the story.
Amy, how about you? How does that work out for somebody who takes a more minimal kind of approach to their backgrounding in a lot of ways? Your backgrounds tend to be fairly modern and fairly understated. Do you view it as a character in their story? Do you view it as something that requires characterization? Or do you really view it more as sort of set dressing? How do you approach it?
Since I do like a drama slice of life thing, there's more just like places where people live and places people go. Probably the backgrounds that have the most character would be Georgia's house, because it contains a bunch of clues about what type of person her grandmother was, because her grandmother was living in that house before she inherited it. So even though it is kind of modern and minimal, there are like decorations in there, and there's bookshelves, and there's other things that would give you kind of a clue about who this character was that you never get to see because she's passed on.
We've just had a really long and in-depth conversation about environments and environmental design, and to me it's so critical as an element of comic art, and it is so simultaneously overrated and underrated. It seems to me to have so much to it that people can overdo it, but it also seems like something that other people shy away from unnecessarily, because it seems too hard. That would be the thing that really gets me about it, is it's such a fine line.
There's a little bit of personality differences that you may get between artists and between readers. I know that I love to read comics that have super, detailed backgrounds and stuff, but that has to be in service of, great characterization and story and humor and whatnot. Otherwise, it will just be kind of, okay, this is pretty to look at but boring to read. I'd rather see good art and, detailed backgrounds in general. But, for some people it may not be as important to have as detailed a backgrounds, and for some people it may even distract. So I feel like there's a broad spectrum of what you can get away with, and knowing what will serve the type of story you're telling best. And I think that Amy's style works really well for that type of story, and, Laura's style works really well for that type of story. We're all doing different levels of detail or realism in our backgrounds in ways that serve the type of story that we want to tell.
I think that's remarkably well put. It's like they say sometimes that good story saves bad art better than good art saves bad story. So if you're going to do it, but make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons and that you're putting in the effort in the right areas. I think that's a really solid point. Does anybody else have anything to add, or do you think we can leave it there?
I guess I would say to people who are just starting out to not be discouraged by backgrounds and to go ahead and embrace technology if that's what they're more comfortable with, and to not listen to, because there are some people who don't embrace technology and they don't like to use the 3D modeling, but don't listen to those people. If you're comfortable with the 3D modeling, do it. So, you got to do what works for you, and you can start out really simple. If you look at Charles Schulz's work, for example, sometimes it's just a little bit line and a little indication of grass, and that's all that was needed to make it look like Charlie Brown was in a space. So just do it and start small or start big if you're confident, but don't be intimidated by background work.
Yeah, another example, Shigeru Mizuki, who did Showa and a bunch of other manga, but Showa is really good. What really stands out in Showa is that the characters are very cartoony and simple, but then he'll have scenes, and it's a photo reference that he illustrated over that is incredibly detailed and realistic with this kind of a Charlie Brown-esque character drawn in that space. It's a really interesting approach, and so sometimes you may run into folks who will, using references means you're lazy or a bad artist, or using photo, you'll always run into these kind of negative Nancy's, but you can look at someone like Shigeru and Showa, and this is a well-loved piece of work by many people, and this guy here, he's using references, and that didn't stop him, and that didn't stop people from loving it.
You heard her, folks. Don't be a negative Nancy. Use reference. You have our permission to use reference. If I had to do this without photo reference, I have something like 1,000 or 2,000, probably at least 3,000 photos by now. Boy, if I had to draw my comic without them, this would be the worst comic ever. But look at the work of European cartoonists like Hergé. You have these very iconic, very simplified characters existing in this almost hyper-detailed environment. Yeah, to circle back on Amy's point as well, don't be afraid. I found out you don't have to be afraid of drawing your backgrounds, because your backgrounds you're going to learn to do that just the way you learn to draw a character. Not being afraid to start is the best place to start, as far as I can tell.
I would also say that, the more you do it, the better you'll get at it, because, doing Title Unrelated, I just was forced to do the backgrounds starting from, the very first page, and the early backgrounds took a long time, and they're very kind of stiff, and angles are a little off sometimes, but as I got better, I got a much better feel for how to do backgrounds, and now it still takes a lot of time and work, but I actually enjoy it a lot more now. And I like to have fun painting the backgrounds, and what kind of world building stuff can I incorporate into the background art, since there's no time to actually, discuss it in the comic.
Well, that's all the time we have for this episode. This program is a production of the Spiderforest Webcomic Collective. Our executive producer is Christina Major, and Eva is our showrunner and our audio engineer. The Spiderforest Webcomic Collective is a creator-owned organization funded by voluntary contributions from our members and from readers and listeners like you. Thanks for your support, and don't forget to go to spiderforest.com to read some of the over 70 webcomics written and drawn by our members. I'm also thrilled to announce that the first volume of Threads, the Spiderforest webcomic anthology, is now going to print thanks to the generous support of over 170 Kickstarter backers. Thank you all for your generous donations. We couldn't have done it without you. It will be available this autumn, so keep an eye on spiderforest.com for more information. I'd like to thank Riana Dorsey for joining us for this episode. You can read her comic Suihira at suihira.com. Thanks also to Christina for bringing us that interview. You can read her comic Sombulus at sombulus.com. I'd also like to thank G. Pike, Amy Stoddard, and Laura Graves for joining in this episode's discussion. G. Pike produces the comic Title Unrelated. You can read it at titleunrelated.com. Amy Stoddard produces the comic Find Sometimes Rain. You can read it at findsometimesrain.genkigirl.com. Laura Graves produces the comic 666 Bistro. You can read it at witchthrone.com. Eva produces the comic Bits Fair. You can read it at bitsfair.com. I produce the comic Six Commando. You can read it at viciousprint.com/sixcommando. And one final note this time, the Spiderforest Webcomic Collective wants you. That's right, our August application season is now open, and we'll be accepting new member applications from now until August 22nd, 2017. So if you have a webcomic and you'd like to join us, go to spiderforest.com for more information. I'm Mathieu Moyen. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.